Chapter 72. How the Admiral sailed out through the Boca del Dragón, and of the danger that he ran. Holding on his westward course, the Admiral found the depth of the sea ever less, so that having come through 4 or 5 fathoms of sea, they found only 2½ at ebb tide, with the tide differing from that at the island of Trinidad. There the water rose 3 fathoms, and here, 45 leagues to the westward, it rose only 1. There, whether ebb or tide, the current flowed westward, while here at flood, it flowed eastward, and at ebb to the west. There the water brackish, and here like river water. Observing these differences, and how shallow was the water there, he dared not go on with his ship, which being almost 100 tons, could not navigate in less than 3 fathoms. He therefore anchored on that coast, which was very secure, because it had a harbor in the form of a horseshoe. Meanwhile, he sent a small caravel, Correo, to survey if there was a passage westward amid those islands. Having gone only a short distance, she returned the next day, August 11th, with a report that at the western end of that sea there was a mouth 2 leagues wide from south to north, and within a round bay with 4 other smaller bays, one toward each quarter of heaven. From each bay there issued a river, whose waters made all that sea so sweet. And farther on the water was much sweeter than where the Admiral was. From this the Admiral concluded that all that land that he had taken for islands was really but a single continent, especially since in all that sea they had never found more than 4 or 5 fathoms of depth, and so much seaweed that they could hardly make their way through it. Being now very certain he could not get out by sailing westward, that same day he turned eastward, with the aim of getting out by the strait that he had seen between the land of Gracia, which the Indians called Paria, and Trinidad. This strait is bounded on the east by the extremity of Trinidad, which the Admiral named Cabo Boto, and on the west by the extremity of the island of Gracia, to which he gave the name Punta de la Lapa. In the middle of this strait are 4 small islands. He named it the Boca del Dragón because of the fury with which the fresh water rushes out to sea there, forming 3 boisterous currents that extend east to west the whole width of the channel, and because the wind failed him as he was sailing through, and he ran great danger of being dashed to pieces by the current on some shoal or reef. He had good reason to give it that name. But it pleased our Lord that what they feared most should prove their salvation, for that same strong current carrying them to safety. Without more delay, on Monday, August 13th, he began to coast westward along the north shore of Paria, intending later to stand over for Española. He gave many thanks to God who had delivered him from so many trials and dangers, ever pointing out to him new lands filled with peaceable folk and great wealth, and especially that land which he now firmly believed to be a continent because of the great size of the Golfo de las Perlas, and of the rivers issuing from it, because all the water in that sea was sweet, because Esdras in chapter 8 of his 4th book says that of the 7 parts of the sphere, only 1 is covered with water, and also because all the Indians in the Cannibal Islands had told them that to the south there lay a very large continent. Chapter 73. How the Admiral stood over from the mainland to Española. Cruising westward along the coast of Paria, the Admiral continually tended offshore to the northwest, because the calms and currents set him in that direction, so that on Wednesday, August 15th, he left the cape that he named the Conchos to the south, and Margarita to the west. He gave that island its name, perhaps by divine inspiration, because next to this island lies that of Cubagua, from which an infinite quantity of pearls or margarites has been taken. A similar thing happened on Española, where on his return from Jamaica, he named certain mountains Todos de Oro, and in those mountains was later found the greatest quantity of gold dust ever brought from Española to Spain. I returned to the Admiral's voyage. He held on his course by 6 little islands that he called Las Garias. 3 others that lay farther north he named Testigos. They discovered much more land to the west of the coast of Paria, but the Admiral writes that he could not give as full an account of it as he wished, because continual watching had made his eyes bloodshot, and therefore he had to write down what he was told by his sailors and pilots. He adds that same night, Thursday, August 16th, the needles, which until then had not varied to the northwest, suddenly varied more than 1.5 points to the northwest, and some more than 2 points. He could not have been mistaken, because he had always kept careful watch. Marveling at this, and regretting that he had not the opportunity to cruise along the coast of the mainland, he held almost due northwest until Monday, August 20th, when he anchored between Bieta Island and Española. From there, he sent some Indians with letters to his brother the Adelantado, acquainting him with his safe arrival and the prosperous outcome of his voyage. He was astonished to find himself so far to the west, for he did not think that the deviation produced by the currents could have been so great. Fearing he might run out of provisions, he stood to the eastward for Santo Domingo, putting in this port on August 30th. The Adelantado had founded the city on the east bank of the river, where it stands today, naming it in memory of his father, who bore the name Domingo. Chapter 74 of the rebellion and disorders caused by the evil alcalde mayor Roldán that the admiral found on his return to Española. Entering the city of Santo Domingo almost blind from his continual vigils, the admiral hoped to rest after that difficult voyage and find his people at peace. But he found all its sixes and sevens, for all the families of the island were infected with a disorderly and rebellious spirit. Part of the people he had left were dead, and of the survivors, more than 160 were sick with the French sickness. Many had joined the rebel Roldán. Moreover, the relief ships he had dispatched from the Canaries had not arrived. I shall relate the course of events in their order, beginning with the day on which the admiral left for Castile. He sailed in March 1496, 30 months elapsing before the day of his return to Española. At the commencement of this period, anticipating the admiral's speedy return with relief for themselves, the people remained fairly peaceful, but after the passage of a year, with the provisions running short and suffering and sickness growing, they became discontented with their present lot and despaired of the future. These disaffected persons making their complaints heard, there arose among them one who sought to stir up the others, and make himself head of a faction. This man was Francisco Roldán, a native of Torre de Don Gemino, whom the admiral had appointed alcalde mayor, by which he obtained so much prestige and authority among both Indians and Christians that he was obeyed as if he were the admiral himself. For this reason, there was not between him and the Adelantado who was governor that harmony that the public weal required, as time and events showed. Since the admiral neither returned nor sent any aid, Roldán began to dream of making himself master of the island, having first killed the admiral's brothers, the principal obstacles to his scheme, and he only waited an opportunity to put his plan into effect. It happened that the Adelantado journeyed to a western province named Zaragua, about 80 leagues from Isabella, leaving Roldán as his lieutenant, but under the authority of Don Diego, the admiral's younger brother. This gave Roldán such offense that while the Adelantado was away compelling the kings of that province to pay the tribute that the admiral had imposed on the Indians of the island, Roldán began secretly to form a faction. But since evil never dares raise its head without some pretext, Roldán seized on the fact that on the beach at Isabella there was a caravel that the Adelantado had built for sending to Castile if it proved necessary. Although it could not be launched for lack of tackle and other equipment, Roldán claimed that this was not so, and demanded it be fitted out that some of them might carry to Castile the news of their distress. On this pretext, he demanded the launching of that caravel, and because Don Diego Columbus would not consent, citing the lack of tackle and rigging, Roldán began to conspire ever more brazenly to have it launched in spite of Don Diego. He told his partisans that the Adelantado and Don Diego opposed it only because they wished to remain masters of the island and keep the rest in subjection, fearing lest the Catholic sovereigns learn of their tyranny. For, said Roldán, they knew how hardly and cruelly the Adelantado treated them, forcing them to work in the fields and build forts. And since they had no hope of the admiral's return with relief, they would do well to take that caravel and obtain their liberty, disdaining to be ruled by a foreigner for wages that were never paid them, while they could be leading an easy and abundant life. All the wealth of the island should be equally divided among them, and they should be allowed to use the Indians as they pleased, free from interference, whereas now they might not even take for themselves any Indian woman they pleased. The Adelantado not only made them observe the 3 monastic vows, but also imposed fasts and floggings, jailings and chastisements, and that for the most trivial fault. Moreover, he, Roldán, had the wand of justice and royal authority, so that no harm would come to them whatever they might do. They should therefore do as he advised, since they could not go wrong. With such words, inspired by his hatred for the Adelantado and hope of gain, he attracted so many to his side that one day the Adelantado, having returned from Zaragua to Isabella, some of them planned to stab him to death, thinking it such easy work that they had ready a rope to hang him up with after he was dead. What wrought them up to do this was the imprisonment of Barahona, a friend of the conspirators. If God had not inspired the Adelantado not to carry out Barahona's death sentence, they doubtless would have killed him then and there. Chapter 75. How Roldán tried to seize the town of Concepcion and plundered Isabella. Perceiving that his plan to have the Adelantado killed had failed, and that his conspiracy was discovered, Roldán determined to seize the town and fortress of Concepcion. believing that with that place as his base, he could easily subjugate the whole island. It was very convenient for his plan that he was near that town, for in the Adelantado's absence, he had been sent by Don Diego with 40 men to pacify the Indians of that province, who had risen with the same aim of seizing the fort and killing the Christians. With the pretext of wishing to put an end to this mischief and punish the Indians, Roldán gathered his men on the farm of a cacique named Marque, intending to carry out his plan at the first opportunity. But the commander of the fort, Ballister, who already had some doubts of his loyalty, kept a strong guard and sent word of his danger to the Adelantado. The latter, with all speed, gathered as many men as he could and hurried to shut himself up in the fort. As his conspiracy was discovered, Roldán went to the fort with a safe conduct, not so much to discuss the settlement as to see what mischief he could do to the Adelantado, and with shameless insolence, he demanded that the Adelantado have the caravel launched, or let him and his friends do it. Angered by these words, the Adelantado replied that neither Roldán nor his friends were seamen, and so knew nothing of handling a ship. Even if they could launch her, they could not sail without rigging and other equipment, the lack of which would expose ship and crew to great danger. The Adelantado spoke as an expert seaman, but they were landlubbers who knew nothing of the business, so the variance of views continued. Having exchanged these and other angry remarks, Roldán marched away in a passion, refusing to resign his office of alcalde mayor or settle their differences as the Adelantado would have him do. He declared he would not do either until the king, whom he represented on the island, had ordered him to do so, for he knew he could expect no justice from the Adelantado, who by one means or another would seek an opportunity to kill him or do him some other injury. Yet, said he, to prove he was a reasonable man, he would go to reside where the Adelantado bid him. Told to proceed to the village of the cacique Don Diego Columbus, he refused, saying there were not enough provisions for his men there, and so he would seek a more suitable place. Thereupon he set out for Isabella, and having assembled 65 men, and found that he could not launch the caravel, he and his henchmen plundered the arsenal and storehouse, taking all the arms, clothing, and food they pleased. Nor could Don Diego Columbus, who was there, do aught to stop them. Indeed, his life would have been in danger if he had not taken refuge in the fortress together with some of his servants, though from the testimony that some later gave in this affair, it appears that Roldán promised to obey him if he would declare against his brother. This he would not do, and Roldán, unable to do him other injury, and fearful of the reinforcements that the Adelantado was sending his brother, marched out of town with all his rebels. As they moved through the countryside, they found herds of cattle grazing, and killed all the steers they needed for their food and took what beasts of burden they needed for the road. The goal was the province of Zaragua, from which the Adelantado had arrived a short time before. They chose to settle in this province because it was the pleasantest and most fertile part of the island, with the most civilized natives, and especially the best-looking and best-natured women in the country. This last was their strongest motive for going there. They did not wish to leave without trying their strength against the Adelantado before he augmented his forces and chastised them as they deserved. So they decided to march on the town of Concepcion, take it by surprise, and kill the Adelantado, who was there. They planned to lay siege to the town if their surprise attack failed, but the Adelantado learned of their plan and prepared his defenses, encouraging his men with spirited words and promises of rich rewards and a grant of 2 slaves apiece. This he did because he knew most of them hankered after the life Roldán offered his followers and were listening to his envoys. It was in fact the hope that all the Adelantado's men would soon come over to his side that encouraged Roldán to begin and persist in his venture. But matters turned out otherwise, for the Adelantado was not only forewarned but was most courageous, had the best men on his side, and had determined to achieve by force of arms what reason and persuasion had failed to gain for him. Gathering his men, then, he marched out of the fort to meet Roldán on the road. Chapter 76. How Roldán roused the Indians of that province against the Adelantado, and how he and his men journeyed to Zaragua. Disappointed in his hope of luring the Adelantado's men to his side, and lacking the courage to meet him in battle, Roldán determined to carry out his first plan of going to Zaragua. As he marched through the countryside, he hurled insults against the Adelantado and spread slanders about him, saying that he, Roldán, had separated from the Adelantado because he was a harsh and vengeful man to Christians and Indians alike, and a very greedy one, as shown by the many obligations and tributes that he imposed on them. It would avail the Indians nothing to pay their tribute regularly, he told them, for the Adelantado would only increase it again, against the wishes of the Catholic sovereigns, who desired nothing from their subjects but obedience, and wished only to maintain them in peace, liberty, and justice. Proclaiming himself their protector and defender, Roldán told the Indians that if they feared to stand up for their rights, he and his men would defend them. Hearing this, the Indians suppressed the tribute that had been levied on them. The result was that the Adelantado could obtain no tribute from the Indians, who lived a great distance away, and he feared to collect it from those nearby lest they be provoked to join the rebels. This policy of forbearance had little effect, for the Adelantado, having left Concepcion, Guardianex, the chief cacique of that province, undertook with Roldán's aid to lay siege to the town and fortress and kill the Christians who guarded it. To accomplish this, he assembled all the caciques subject to him, and secretly agreed with them that each should kill the Christians in his province. Because the area cultivated by each Indian is not large enough to support many people, the Christians were obliged to disperse into bands or companies of 8 or 10 to a district. This gave the Indians hope that by a surprise attack upon the Christians, they might succeed in wiping them all out. Their only way of reckoning time or anything else being on their fingers, the Indians agreed to launch the attack on the first day of the next full moon. After Guardianex had instructed the caciques about this, the principal one among them, desiring to gain honor by what he conceived to be an easy feat, and being in any case too poor an astronomer to know for sure the first day of the full moon, attacked the Christians before the appointed day. He was repelled and forced to flee, and when he sought a haven with Guardianex, was instead put to death for prematurely revealing the conspiracy. This failure caused the rebels great disappointment, for the conspiracy was hatched with their favor and knowledge, and they had awaited its outcome before forming an alliance with Guardianex to destroy the Adelantado. As matters turned out, contrary to their hopes, they did not feel secure in the province where they were, and they departed for Zaragua, still proclaiming themselves protectors of the Indians. Actually, they were not but plain thieves, having no regard for God or man, and seeking only to sate their inordinate appetite, each robbing what he could, and their leader Roldán more than all the rest. Thus he urged and ordered the principal men and the caciques to collect all they could from their people, saying he would protect the Indians and the rebels from the tribute demanded by the Adelantado. With this pretext, he took an even greater tribute from them, making a single cacique named Maniqueotex pay him a calabash filled with gold dust worth 3 marks every 3 months. And to ensure payment, he held the cacique's son and nephew hostages, claiming he did this as a mark of friendship. As my readers may wonder why I reduce gold marks to calabash measure, I should explain that I do it to show that in such cases the Indians, having no weights, dealt by the measure. Chapter 77. How ships arrived from Castile with provisions and relief. The Christians being so divided and the relief ships from Castile much delayed in coming, neither the Adelantado nor Don Diego could prevent the growth of discontent among their people. Most of them were men of base condition who hankered for the easy life that Roldán promised, and since they feared being left out in the cold, they were reluctant to join in punishing the rebels. So unruly did they become that there was no way of quieting them, and the Adelantado and Don Diego had to bear without recourse the insults of the rebels. But the Almighty was pleased to assist them, for at this time there arrived those 2 ships that had been sent out 1 year after the admiral's departure from the Indies, as a result of his great importunities and pleadings at court. The admiral, knowing the situation on Española, and the kind of men he had left there, and the great dangers that his long absence might occasion, obtained of the Catholic sovereigns that 2 of the fleet of 8 ships he had been ordered to outfit should go in advance. The arrival of these ships, with reinforcements and food, together with a certain knowledge that the admiral had landed safely in Spain, encouraged the Adelantado's men to serve him more loyally, and inspired fear of punishment in Roldán's followers. As the rebels wished to hear news of Spain and obtain some provisions for their needs, and also to lure some of the new arrivals to their side, they set out for Santo Domingo, where the ships had put in. But the Adelantado was warned of their coming, and being near the port, he placed strong guards at certain passes to bar their way while he proceeded to the port to greet the ships, and order the affairs of that city. Since he wanted the admiral to find the island at peace on his return, he again proposed a settlement to Roldán, who was 6 leagues distant, and sent as emissary the captain of the newly arrived ships, Pedro Fernandez Coronel. The Adelantado chose him because he was a man of worth and honor, and because as an eyewitness he could confirm the admiral's safe arrival in Spain, and the friendly reception and the honors he had received from the Catholic sovereigns. But the rebel leaders feared the impression Coronel might make on their men, and would not permit him to address them in public. They came out to meet him with crossbows and arrows ready,
and would only allow him to say a few words to persons appointed for that purpose. Consequently, he returned without any agreement, and the rebels departed for their quarters in Zaragoza. Some feared lest Roldán and certain other leaders write to friends in the Adelantado's camp to intercede for them with the admiral on his return, saying that their just complaints were directed only against the Adelantado and not against the admiral, whose obedient servants they again wished to be.
Chapter 78. How the 3 ships sent by the admiral from the Canary Islands arrived at Zaragoza. Having told of those 2 ships sent by the admiral from Castile to Española, I shall now tell of the 3 that separated from him in the Canaries. These ships had fair weather till they reached the Caribbean Islands, which are the first that mariners encounter on the way to the port of Santo Domingo.
As the pilots were not as familiar with the navigation of those islands as are the pilots today, they did not steer a proper course to that port, and they were carried by the current so far westward that they arrived on the coast of Zaragoza, where the rebels were. Learning that these ships were off their course and did not know of the revolt, some of the rebels made their way aboard, pretending to be there by the Adelantado's orders to secure provisions and pacify the country. But a secret shared by many is no secret, and before long, the most alert of the captains, Alonso Sanchez de Carvajal, had learned the truth. He then sought to negotiate a peace with Roldán, hoping to secure his submission to the Adelantado. But the talks and chumming of the rebels with the ship's people caused Carvajal's efforts to fail. For Roldán had received secret assurances from many of the newcomers from Castile that they would join in his gang, and with this advantage he was in no mood to make concessions. Perceiving that the negotiations were dragging on without issue, Carvajal decided with the approval of the other captains to send the laborers they had brought to work for pay in the mines or at other tasks overland to Santo Domingo. The winds and currents being very contrary, the ship might be 3 months at sea without making port, and in that time their people would consume their provisions and might fall sick, losing time that should have been employed in the service for which they came. This decision made, Juan Antonio Colombo was selected to march overland with the 40 laborers. Pedro de Arana should return with the ships, and Carvajal was to remain and try to reach an agreement with the rebels. However, when Juan Antonio got ready to depart the day after landing, those laborers, or rather vagabonds, deserted to the rebels, leaving their captain with 6 or 7 loyal men. Seeing this barefaced treason, Captain Colombo fearlessly accosted Roldán and told him that since he claimed to be a loyal servant of the Catholic sovereigns, he should not allow these men who had come out to colonize and cultivate the land, and who had already received their wages, to idle away their time instead of working at their tasks. He should prove his good faith by dismissing those men. If he allowed them to stay, he would show that he was moved by a rebellious spirit and hatred for the admiral, and that he wished to obstruct the service of his sovereigns. This incident greatly compromised Roldán and his henchmen, but since it served their purposes, and especially since it was easy to plead helplessness in the face of an offense committed by so many, Roldán excused himself from carrying out the captain's request. He said that he could not coerce his people. His monastery, said he, was governed by rules that denied the habit to no man. Juan Antonio decided it was useless and dangerous to insist without hope of success, so he returned to the ships with his few followers. That the same thing might not occur with the remaining men, both captains hastened to depart for Santo Domingo. The weather proved as contrary as they had feared, and they were delayed many days. Their provisions spoiled, and Carvajal's ship suffered great damage on some shoals where he lost his rudder and sprang a leak in the keel, admitting so much water they had great trouble to bring her in. Chapter 79. How the captains found the admiral in Santo Domingo. On their arrival at Santo Domingo from Zaragoza, the captains found there the admiral, who had meantime returned from the continent. Although he was fully informed about the rebels, had seen the charges drawn up by the Adelantado against them, and knew they merited severe punishment, he decided to gather new testimony in order to inform the Catholic sovereigns of what had happened. At the same time, he resolved to be as moderate as he could in this affair, that the rebels might more easily be reduced to obedience. Therefore, that none of the people might say he was held there by force, on September 22nd, he issued a decree promising food and free passage home to all who desired it. At this time, learning that Roldán and part of his people were bound for Santo Domingo, he ordered Miguel Ballester, alcaide of the fortress of Concepcion, to maintain a good watch over that fortress and province. If Roldán came there, he should tell him that the admiral greatly deplored his sufferings and all that had happened there, and that he wished to bury the past in oblivion, granting a general pardon to all. Roldán should come to confer with him without fear of reprisal, that they might consider how the interests of the Catholic sovereigns could best be served. If Roldán felt he needed a safe conduct, the admiral would send him one in such form as he desired. On September 24th, Ballister replied that he had certain news that Riquelme had arrived the day before at the village of Bonao, and that Adrian de Mujica and Roldán, the rebel chieftains, were to meet there 7 or 8 days later, at which time and place he would be able to capture them, as in fact he later did. He added that he had spoken with them according to the admiral's instructions, but found them very stubborn and brazenly defiant. Roldán declared that he had not come to negotiate and did not want or need peace, for he had the admiral in the hollow of his hand and could help him or destroy him as he pleased. Roldán also declared there could be no talk of pacts or agreements until they had released all the Indians captured in the siege of Concepcion, since they had assembled to serve their king, and with the Adelantado's promise of safety. Roldán said other things that showed he wanted no agreement that was not to his very great advantage. Finally, he asked the admiral to send Carvajal to negotiate with him. Roldán said he would treat only with Carvajal because he was a reasonable and prudent man, as he had shown at the time of the arrival of the 3 ships at Zaragoza. This reply caused the admiral to distrust Carvajal, and with good cause. In the first place, he recalled that before Carvajal's arrival at Zaragoza, where the rebels were, they had often written to friends who were with the Adelantado that they, the rebels, would place themselves in the admiral's hands as soon as he arrived, and had prayed these friends to intercede for them with him. Second, if they did this on learning of the arrival of the 2 ships sent to relieve the Adelantado, they had much more reason to seek clemency after learning of the admiral's arrival, unless the talk they had with Carvajal dissuaded them. Third, had Carvajal desired to do his duty, he could have made Roldán and his principal lieutenants prisoners aboard his caravel, for they were with him 2 whole days without a safe conduct. Fourth, since Carvajal knew they were in rebellion, he should not have permitted them to buy 54 swords and 40 crossbows. Fifth, having received warnings that the men who went ashore with Juan Antonio Colombo intended to desert to the rebels, he should not have let them land. Or, learning that they had joined the rebels, he should have made greater efforts to persuade them to return. Sixth, Carvajal went about declaring that he had come to the Indies to stay with the admiral, and see that he did nothing without him, because in Castile it was feared that the admiral might commit some blunder. Seventh, Carvajal had brought the admiral a written message from Roldán saying that by Carvajal's advice he had come to Santo Domingo with his people in order to be near at hand when the admiral arrived at Española, that he, Roldán, might treat with him. And now that the admiral had come, it appeared from Roldán's insolent bearing in such contrast with the tone of his letter that Carvajal had invited him, so that in case the admiral was delayed or failed to come, Carvajal himself, as the admiral's associate, and Roldán, as alcalde mayor, might rule over the island in defiance of the Adelantado. Eighth, when the other 2 captains came by sea with the 3 caravels and Carvajal came overland to Santo Domingo, he was accompanied and guarded by a rebel leader named Gamez, who stayed 2 days and nights with him aboard his ship and accompanied him to within 6 leagues of Santo Domingo. Ninth, Carvajal corresponded with the rebels when they went to the Bonao and sent them gifts and food. 10th and last, the rebels would treat only with him and unanimously declared that if they had to choose a new leader, they would make him their captain. The admiral reflected, on the other hand, that Carvajal was a discreet and prudent man, and an hidalgo as well, that each suspicious circumstance could separately be explained away, and that what he had been told about Carvajal might not be true. And finally, regarding Carvajal as a person faithful to his trust and one who sincerely wished to quench the flames of discord, the admiral decided to consult with all his lieutenants about the answer to be given to Roldán. As all were in accord, the admiral sent Carvajal and the alcalde Ballister to negotiate a pact. All they could get out of Roldán, however, was that since they had not released the Indians, as he demanded, he would not discuss a pact with them. Carvajal made an effective reply, and argued so well that he persuaded Roldán and 3 or 4 of his lieutenants to come to confer with the admiral. This incensed the other rebels, and when Roldán and some others were mounting their horses to depart with Carvajal, these rebels surrounded them and would not allow them to go. They said that if any agreement was to be made, it must be done in writing, that all might know what it contained. Some days later, therefore, on October 15th, Roldán wrote the admiral a letter, approved by all the rebels, in which he put all the blame for the revolt on the Adelantado. He wrote that since the admiral had not sent them a written safe conduct so that they might come to explain to him all that had happened, they had decided to send him their conditions for peace in writing. Their demands were immoderate and insolent, but the next day Ballister wrote the admiral, praising Carvajal's peacemaking efforts, and declaring that since Carvajal could not convince them to abandon their wicked designs, nothing would do but to grant them the terms they demanded. For such was the spirit of the rebels. He, Ballister, was certain the majority of the admiral's men would go over to them, and though the admiral might have confidence in his servants and the honest men about him, they could not resist that great force of rebels, whose number was daily increased by new recruits. This the admiral already knew from experience, for in view of Roldán's being so near Santo Domingo, the admiral had mustered up all the men who were fit to bear arms. He found that between those who pretended to be lame and those who claimed to be sick, he had less than 70 men to go out against the rebels, and of these, less than 40 could be relied on. Next day, October 17th, 1498, Roldán and the other rebel leaders, who had wanted to confer with the admiral, sent him a letter bearing their signatures in which they wrote that they had quit the Adelantado because he plotted to slay them, and that they had awaited the coming of his lordship, their master, thinking that he would consider what they had done as a service to him. For this reason they had prevented their men from doing any injury to his lordship or his possessions, as they might easily have done. On his arrival, however, his lordship not only showed displeasure at their actions, but even sought to harm them. Now wishing to do honorably that which they had resolved to do and enjoy freedom of action, they were quitting him and his service. Before the admiral received this letter, he had already sent Roldán a personal message through Carvajal, expressing his confidence in Roldán and assuring him of the favorable account he had given of him to the Catholic sovereigns. He added that he had not written to him for fear that if some of the common people saw his letter, they might do Roldán some mischief. Instead of the letter, he was sending the alcalde Ballister, in whom, as Roldán knew, he placed great trust, and with whom Roldán could speak as if he were the admiral himself. Roldán should therefore consider what was proper for him to do, and he would find the admiral ready to discuss every reasonable proposal. On October 18th, the admiral dispatched 5 ships to Spain, and by them he sent the Catholic sovereigns a detailed account of all that had happened, saying that he had delayed the departure of those ships since his arrival, in the belief that Roldán and his men would leave in them, as they had announced they would do. The other 3 ships were being readied for the Adelantado to continue the exploration of the mainland of Paria, and to organize the fishing and trade in pearls, samples of which he sent to the sovereigns with Carvajal. Chapter 80. How Roldán came to treat with the admiral, and how they failed to reach agreement. 3 days after he received the admiral's letter, Roldán replied, expressing readiness to comply with the admiral's wishes. However, as his men would not consent to his going to see the admiral without a safe conduct, he asked that one be sent him in the form described in the letter that he and his lieutenants had signed and sent to the admiral. The admiral promptly sent him a safe conduct, October 26th. Roldán then came to confer with the admiral, but his insolent demand showed that he was more interested in suborning as many of the admiral's men as possible than in reaching an agreement. He therefore left the admiral without any accord, saying he would report everything to his men and would inform the admiral of their decision. In order that the admiral might have a representative who could negotiate and conclude an agreement in his name, a major domo of his, Diego de Salamanca, went with Roldán. After much debate, Roldán sent certain articles of agreement for the admiral to sign, and on November 6th, he wrote that this agreement was the best he could get from his men. If his illustrious lordship approved of it, he should send his acceptance to Concepcion, because the Bonao no longer supplied enough food for Roldán's people. He, Roldán, would await a reply until next Monday. Having seen this letter and the articles with their insolent demands, the admiral would on no account sign them, lest he bring justice into contempt and dishonor both himself and his brothers. But that the rebels might have no further reason to complain or say that he treated them harshly, on November 11th, the admiral ordered publication of an amnesty, which was affixed for 30 days to the doors of the fort. Its tenor was that in spite of some differences having arisen during his stay in Castile between the Adelantado and the alcalde mayor Roldán and some other persons who had fled to him, all in general and each individually could safely return to the service of the Catholic sovereigns as if nothing had happened, and whosoever desired to return to Castile would be provided free passage and given an order for payment of their wages as was customary, providing they presented themselves in the space of 30 days to receive the protection of this amnesty. He warned that if they did not appear within that space of time, he would proceed against them, as the law required. Then he sent Carvajal to Roldán with this assurance, signed by himself, together with a written explanation of why he, the admiral, neither could nor should sign the articles sent to him. He again reminded the rebels of what they should do if they wished to serve the Catholic sovereigns, as their duty required. With this writing, Carvajal went to Concepcion to see the rebels, who acted very proud and haughty, mocking the admiral's pardon and saying he would soon be seeking a pardon from them. All this happened in the space of 3 weeks. During that time, on the pretext of wanting to seize a man that Roldán wanted to put to death, they kept Ballister under siege in the fort and cut off his supply of water, thinking that for lack of it he would surrender. But on Carvajal's arrival, they raised the siege, and after much dispute between the two sides, they reached the following agreement. Chapter 81. The agreement made between the admiral and Roldán and his rebels. The agreement made with the alcalde mayor Francisco Roldán and his company for their departure and voyage to Castile. First, that the Lord Admiral would give him 2 good ships, vouched by seamen to be properly equipped, to be delivered to him at the port of Zaragoza, because most of his followers are there and because it is the most convenient harbor for securing and getting ready provisions and all else that may be necessary. From that port, with God's favor, the said alcalde mayor and his company will embark for Castile. That his lordship will order paid the wages due them up to the day of sailing, and will write to the Catholic sovereigns attesting to their good service that they may be paid. That he shall grant them slaves from the distribution made to the people, as compensation for the sufferings they have endured on this island, and for the services they have rendered, confirming this grant. And as some of the said company have mates who are pregnant, or have borne them children, if they wish to take these women, they may go in place of the slaves, and their children shall be free and may go with them. That his lordship will order the said ships loaded with all the provisions they may need for the said voyage, as has been done with others. And since they cannot be supplied with bread, he will permit the alcalde mayor and his company to secure bread at their own expense, wherever they may be, and will see that they are given 3,000 kilograms of biscuit, or in lieu of it, 30 sacks of wheat, so that if their cassava bread should spoil, as might easily happen, they could subsist on the said wheat. Item, that his lordship will give safe conducts to the persons who come to obtain orders for the payment of their wages. Inasmuch as some of the persons with the alcalde mayor have had some goods taken from them and embargoed, his lordship will order these goods returned to them. Item, that his lordship will give them a letter for the Catholic sovereigns in which he will attest that certain hogs belonging to the said alcalde mayor have been left behind to provision the people of this island. These hogs numbering 120 large and 230 small, and will pray their highnesses to cause him to be paid the price they would have brought on the island. These hogs were taken from him in February 1498. That his lordship will give the said alcalde mayor license to sell some of the things that he must sell in order to depart, doing with them as he pleases, or leaving them in charge of such person as he may designate. That his lordship will order the judges to settle speedily the case of the horse. That, if his lordship finds the claims of Diego de Salamanca to be just, he will write the said judge to cause them to be paid. Item, that the question of the slaves belonging to the captains will be negotiated with his lordship. That, inasmuch as the said alcalde mayor and his company fear that his lordship or some other person acting for him may seek to do them some mischief with the ships remaining on the island, he will give them a safe conduct, promising in the names of the Catholic sovereigns and on his own faith and word as an hidalgo, as is customary in Spain, that neither his lordship nor any other person will harm them or prevent their sailing. Having seen this agreement, made by Alonso Sanchez de Carvajal and Diego de Salamanca, with Francisco Roldán and his company, this day, Wednesday, November 21st, 1498, I, the Admiral, agree to observe it in its present form on condition that the said Francisco Roldán, or any other of his company in whose names he signed and ratified the capitulation given by him to the aforesaid Alonso Sanchez de Carvajal and Diego de Salamanca, shall not admit into their company any other Christian on the island of any state and condition whatever. And I, Francisco Roldán, alcalde mayor, in my name and that of all the persons in my company, promise and pledge my faith and word that the above conditions will be observed and carried out, without any fraud, loyally and truly, as set down here his lordship observing all that has been treated and agreed upon between Senor Alonso Sanchez de Carvajal, Diego de Salamanca, and myself, as is set forth in the articles. First, that from this day till he gives his reply, which will be in a space of 10 days, I shall not admit into my company any of the Lord Admiral's people. Item, that within 50 days after the said reply is brought and delivered to me, in Concepcion, with his lordship's approval of what has been agreed upon and signed, which shall be within 10 days, we shall embark and sail for Castile. Item, that none of the slaves that were given us in the distribution shall be taken from us by force. Item, that if the Lord Admiral should not be present at the port whence we are going to embark, the person or persons sent thither by his lordship shall be honored and respected as ministers of the Catholic sovereigns and of his lordship. These persons will be given an accounting of all that is embarked on those caravels, that they make note thereof, or do what seems best to his lordship, and that they may set apart the things in our charge that belong to the Catholic sovereigns. It is understood that all the said articles are to be signed and executed by his lordship, just as they are carried in writing by the said Alonso Sanchez de Carvajal and the said Diego de Salamanca. I shall await his reply here, in Concepcion, for 8 days from this time, and if he should not reply, I shall not be bound by anything said herein. A witness whereof, in that I and all the men of my company shall observe and carry out all that I have said, I have signed this instrument with my hand. Done in Concepcion this day, Saturday, November 16th, 1498.